Good afternoon, everyone. I think I'm going to get started. We're still waiting for a few more folks to arrive, but in the interest of time and punctuality, I think I'll get the ball rolling. My name is Eric Olson. I'm a senior advisor for a security initiative here at the Mexico Institute, and I want to welcome you here to our center. We are very honored and thrilled to have this opportunity to bring to you this very fine book produced by two very close colleagues of the Mexico Institute, one of whom we've stolen from the University of San Diego, but a book that I think you probably saw out on the desk. You can definitely purchase it there. Police and Public Security in Mexico. And I can tell you, having just returned recently from 9 days on the U.S.-Mexico border, there's no more timely issue right now in Mexico and in U.S.-Mexico relations than the issue of public security and the role of the police. There's nothing more urgent right now than assisting and supporting a process of professionalization and modernization of the police in Mexico. It's in Mexico's interest, obviously, but it's also in the U.S. interest to see that process move forward. So this book, I don't know if you were brilliant in planning the timing on this book, but I have to say that it's just well-timed and really apropos to the debates going on here in Washington and in Mexico and between both countries, and congratulations on that. What we're going to do today, we have a tremendous lineup of people who are very familiar with the intricacies and the I would even say in the weeds on this issue, but we're thrilled to have them all here. The two principal editors of the book, my colleague Robert Donnelly, who previous to being here at the Mexico Institute as our program associate, was a director of the Justice Project at the Transborder Institute at the University of San Diego, and we were lucky enough to sort of steal him away and have him join us here on the the East Coast, right? And we're thrilled that you've been part of this, and we will hear from him in just a moment. The other main editor of this book is Dr. David Shirk, director of the Transborder Institute at the University of San Diego. We've had the very good fortune to have him here in Washington at the Wilson Center as a visiting fellow. I was just delighted to be able to travel with him and my other colleagues to San Diego and Tijuana just a couple of weeks ago, put together a marvelous program visiting with authorities and the police and various law enforcement agencies in the Tijuana and San Diego area, and I know no one that's more knowledgeable than David about what's going on in that critical place. They will both make comments and we've also asked one of the authors in the book, Daniel Sabet, who is a visiting professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He's a real expert on local police in Mexico, municipal level police, where so much of the key issues that have to be dealt with in terms of professionalization are playing themselves out now. We're also fortunate to have Daniel as part of our own in-house research project doing a chapter for us on the police in Mexico. So thank you, Daniel, for being here. And then we've asked two folks to be discussants or make comments on the book and the presentations. First, Marcelo Bergman, here directly to my right, also a visiting scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, but more well known as a professor and scholar at the CIDE, the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica of Mexico, and a real expert on the issue of public security as well. So thank you and welcome. And then last but certainly not least, Michael McCullough from the American Bar Association's Rule of Law program will also be commenting. The ABA program has numerous projects in Mexico that are dealing with training of law enforcement and the justice system. Michael has a lot of background in this area, having been chief of party in Bolivia and Bogota on justice reform type projects. And so we have been working with them, cooperating with them recently, and we're delighted to have him comment as well on the presentations. So we have a tremendous lineup. Really grateful for all your interest in coming today. I'm going to pass the baton, if you will, to Robert Donnelly.
Thank you very much, Eric. Before beginning my presentation, I would like to express my thanks to Andrew Seeley, the director of the Mexico Institute, for today's launch here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, for his guidance and support and his generous and insightful comments at the launch of Police and Public Security in Mexico at the University of San Diego last month. Also like to thank Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program, and also Eric Olson, senior advisor of the Mexico Institute Security Initiative, for their insight on the study of citizen security, the rule of law, organized crime, and other important issues facing Mexico and the region. Thank you also to co-editor and Wilson Center Fellow David Shirk, who serves as director of the Justice in Mexico Project at the University of San Diego, and to author Daniel Sabet, as well as to discussants Mike McCullough and Marcelo Bergman. David, if we could go to slide 4. Police and public security was born from a desire to better understand Mexico's police amid the ongoing militarization of public security in the country. Serving as a point of departure for this study was the meeting Seguridad Pública y Reforma Penal en México, held at the University of Guadalajara in July 2007. That meeting brought together 24 experts from Mexico and the United States to discuss the militarization of public security at a time of intense nationwide debate on the legality and net effectiveness of what was then a cornerstone of the government counter-narcotic strategy, troop deployments to drug trafficking hotspots. Yet the meeting also prompted a more holistic diagnosis of the principal public security challenges facing Mexico, offered related policy options, and included the perspectives of state and local public security officials, as well as of researchers. From that meeting, we developed what would become the theoretical framework for this project, identifying the following broad themes: crime trends and the contours of the public security crisis, the historical relationship between state actors and organized crime, police structures and cultures, the evolving role of the military, human rights and the social construction of crime, and local police reform efforts. We invited 7 authors, 4 from Guadalajara, 1 from Washington, and 2 from Mexico City to probe these issues, asking them to take into account the high levels of cartel violence afflicting parts of the country, the public's increasing fear of common and organized crime, and Mexico's evolving political landscape. I would like to now briefly summarize 6 of the monograph chapters, starting with Marcos Pablo Moloesnik. In his chapter, University of Guadalajara scholar Marcos Pablo Moloesnik discusses the military, its evolving mission to fight organized crime, and the greater institutionalization of the military in national security policymaking. He notes that the militarization of public security is a consequence of deep and pervasive problems in civilian law enforcement, yet he also signals that greater reliance on the military increases its autonomy, making it less answerable to civilian authorities, and that an open-ended mission with a long horizon makes the military even more prone to those influences of corruption that have compromised and tarnished the civilian police. Guillermo Cepeda of ITESO explains why police reform is essential to improving public perceptions of democratic governance. After all, the police officer is arguably the most visible representative of the state, and his interaction with the public redounds negatively or positively on the competence and judgment of elected officials. In his chapter, Cepeda also discusses the historically politicized criminal justice system and how it is today undergoing change toward a more accusatorial model, with public trials in open courtrooms and a greater emphasis on oral testimony. But he signals that reforms are taking place unevenly and that the risk exists of such changes compounding the inefficiencies and inequities of the existing system. Cepeda's prescriptive analysis suggests that quantitative improvements, more police on the street, for example, may be ineffective, and that better measures are needed to evaluate the results of public security policy, not just the inputs. In the successive chapter, ITESO researcher Jorge Rocha Quintero discusses public security policy and human rights. Enforcement-heavy policy, he says, can be a blunt and counterproductive instrument leading to human rights abuses and violations of civil liberties, criminalizing social protests and further marginalizing defenseless groups, such as urban youth, while also exposing the state's weakness and lack of effective non-coercive conflict resolution capabilities. And he specifically cites the San Salvador Atenco and Oaxaca City clashes of 2006. Rocha warns of a trend that justifies civil liberties violations in the name of national defense, and he is concerned that individual human rights are continuously being whittled down to a nucleus of minimum standards, while national security is given a more maximalist iteration, an increasingly broader mandate and scope. Carlos Flores of CSS UNAM traces the history of organized crime and state relations from the 1960s to the present. He divides this history into two eras, one characterized by a powerful central state from 1960 to 1994, able to exert deep control over organized crime, the other from 1994 to the present, characterized by a weaker central state, greater political plurality, and decentralization, and affected by exogenous changes that made Mexico-based cartels richer and more powerful than before, while they at the same time became more violent, ruthless, and more brazen in attacking official targets. Flores draws the conclusion that a shift has taken place in relations between state actors and organized crime, going from a centralized hierarchical model to one that is more diffuse, multifaceted, and unpredictable. The result has been greater disequilibrium and competition among and within cartels, explaining the violence afflicting parts of the country. In her chapter, anthropologist Maru Suarez asks the questions, who exactly are municipal police officers, under what conditions do they work, and what does daily police work really look like? An anthropologist from the University of Guadalajara, she advances our understanding of these questions through ethnographic observation and interviews. She discusses the structural factors that guide the behavior of police officers, their exposure to corruption from above, their stigmatization by fellow citizens, the pent-up hostility and aggression of the station house. And she explains how these forces can lead to routine instances of brutality, abusive authority, and due process violations. Suarez also identifies other trends emerging from the state's failure to ensure public security. It foists upon individual citizens a greater responsibility for ensuring personal safety, and it can engender a society more willing to accept force to fight what it considers to be crime. She also hints that public security failures can foster vigilantism and other threats to the consolidation of democracy. In the final chapter, fellow anthropologist Elena Aceola of CSS UNAM reminds us that police officers are individuals. Through ethnographic observation and interviews, she describes the truly deplorable conditions under which many officers work: 24-hour shifts, abysmal pay, constant ridicule from fellow citizens. They are even forced to buy their own provisions, bulletproof jackets, ammunition, and even in some cases, vehicles. All factors that discourage morale and contribute to their susceptibility to corrupt practices. Like Suarez, she describes a highly discretionary good old boy system built on patronage, absent clearly delineated rules, expectations, or rewards. Her analysis signals the need for the professionalization of the police forces and the creation of a career civil service track for officers. That is the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to take your questions and comments in the Q&A. But for right now, I'd like to turn it over to Daniel Sabet for a discussion on local level police reform efforts in Chihuahua.
You going to switch for me?
I'll switch for you unless you want to switch with me.
Maybe I should switch with you,
Sounds good.
if you wouldn't mind.
Not at all. No, I think you're good. Oh, no problem.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robert, very much. First off, I'd just like to thank everybody for the invitation today and to really recommend the book. Robert unfortunately had to go through some of those chapters rather quickly, but really there's outstanding and excellent stuff in there, and for the most part, it's the first time a lot of that material has been available in English. Elena Aceola, for example, and Maria Eugenia Suarez de Garay have written great anthropological works on Mexican policing, but those things are not available in English, and so this is a really important contribution, I think, to the literature. So I'm very glad that it's out there, and I'm very glad to have been invited to participate in it. My own chapter looked at a case of Chihuahua, the municipal police department in Chihuahua, which I argue is very much a model of municipal police reform. Now there's a few more detractors against me these days because Chihuahua, of course, is the center of a great deal of organized crime violence, and there have been revelations of corruption within this police department. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Of course, so I'm just going to give kind of a brief overview of some of the material in the chapter. Some of it's some of the things I talked about last time I was invited to speak here, so I apologize if there's any redundancy. But of course, we all recognize the need for local police reform, corruption, human rights abuses, ineffectiveness. And what I do in my research is kind of look at several key areas of reform. They're not all of the possible areas to look at, but the ones I look at are presented up here. And I have a comparative case study of 4 different cases and then a survey of 11 additional cases that were kind of some of the largest departments and the best departments throughout the country. And so I'm looking at selection and recruitment training, positive incentives, equipment, promotion procedures, and accountability mechanisms. And so this chapter really focuses on Chihuahua, which is certainly deserving of its own chapter. And the main puzzle I'm really concerned about, I mean, I have 4 here, but the main one is this top one. If there are over 3,000 police forces, why are there so few success stories? That's supposed to be the benefit of a federal system, is that you have the laboratories of democracies working for you, and so there should be cases of success and cases of failure and a lot in between, and we should be able to learn from those cases of success. And that is true, and certainly we can learn from Chihuahua, and a lot of departments have learned from Chihuahua, and that's probably one of the most important things about this research, I think, is that many of the things that made Chihuahua unique 3-4 years ago have now been replicated across the country. But even with that, you still have a very small handful of cases that could be held up as success stories, and even among those cases, you still have loads of corruption, problems of human rights violations, and of course ineffectiveness. So why do we have so few success stories? And for me, really, because if it's 3,000 cases and very few success stories, it's suggesting that there's something systematic going on here. It's not just a matter of a few rotten apples and whatnot. So there is plenty of evidence of success in Chihuahua, although some folks might be forgetting that with the current drug-related violence in the state. Accredited by the Commission on the Accreditation of Law Enforcement Agencies, a U.S.-based nonprofit, accredited its training by its state education agency, was recognized as the Atlas Global Alliance is kind of an interesting study where they go around, they select random police departments, and then they go visit them and they rank them. And Chihuahua was first on that list. The Fox administration gave them an award, and surveys bear out greater public confidence in the police, although not by much. But that's another issue. So just very briefly, a few of the things that kind of can be held up as positives. Selection and recruitment, training and education, and purchasing of equipment. These are kind of the low-hanging fruit in police reform. Throw some money at it, throw some political will at it. You're not tackling corruption. But still, up until Chihuahua, many departments had not made the decision to tackle these challenges. High school education has been required among incoming recruits since 2006. Several departments are now requiring high school education, but that's relatively new. Even just 10 years ago, primary education was all that was required. Acceptance rate of all qualified applicants in the last generation of cadets, 15.67% were selected, so that shows a little greater selectivity. Compared to 8 other cities that answered my survey, their average was about 34%. And those are the best departments in the country, so Chihuahua is kind of standing out there. Training and education, their academy is accredited, so you leave their academy, you have a technical degree, kind of like a community college degree. It's a 10-month training with 3 practical months, and that's, again, ahead of the averages in my survey. 6.6 was the average there. About half the department has a high school education, which is not great. We would rather everybody does, but it is pretty impressive, or it is higher than the other averages of other departments. And major effort at promoting education in the higher ranks of the department, and that's really important. The previous chief really stressed education. Most of his higher level officers were also attending night classes to get masters and college degrees in public security. And that required a lot of commitment because it means these are guys that are normally working kind of 24/7, and it means taking them out of service and giving them the time to pursue degrees. And so that is kind of unprecedented. And to move up in the ranks to become an officer, you now are required to have a high school degree. So an impressive change there. Positive incentive salary is still not very good. Works out to about $647 a month, 8,745 pesos a month. So still not great, but ahead of the national averages. Equipment is really where they've been pretty impressive. Their rate of police vehicles to officers is 0.68. So for every officer, there's 0.68 vehicles, if that makes sense. If there's 100 officers, there's 68 vehicles. And that's double any of the other departments that responded to the survey. And that's really where Chihuahua has invested a great deal in terms of equipment and did it with municipal resources. Now, a lot of the departments, and this is one of the important advancements that we need to recognize, is a lot of the departments using federal subsidy money have improved their fleets of vehicles, bulletproof vests, armaments, guns, and all kinds of fun toys like these kinds of helicopters. Chihuahua's had a helicopter for a number of years, so huge advancements there in terms of equipment. The weaknesses in procedures is without a doubt the greatest success. CALEA is a accreditation agency here in the United States. Chihuahua is to date the only agency to be accredited by CALEA. Several have been recognized, which is kind of a lower level of accreditation, but Chihuahua is still, and they were accredited back in 2007, so an impressive advancement there. Advances in terms of promotion, in the interest of time, I'll skip that, but accountability mechanisms remains the weakness. And this is across the board, I think, in most Mexican departments. I mentioned in the beginning, selection, recruitment, training. These are kind of the low-hanging fruits. These are where a lot of departments are really dramatically improving things. But in terms of accountability mechanisms, you're still seeing very limited accountability mechanisms. In Chihuahua is the case. They fired, based on federal vetting, about 40 police officers last year. And all of those officers have said that they're innocent and that they were filed unjustly and have raised some legal issues so accountability mechanism is still very weak in Chihuahua. What makes Chihuahua different? Has some more resources, historically less organized crime, but the real argument I make is about continuity of reform efforts. And I ask in all the departments I go to, kind of when did the police department begin to professionalize? And several officers interviewed said 1992 in Chihuahua. And this was unprecedented. Most departments would say, well, this administration has done a great deal and kind of give this administration line. And they were able to go back to 1992 as an important point of departure. And the reason was they had brought a U.S. cop to serve in the academy. He implemented a variety of standardization reforms and a specialization of units, and we saw some major and the interesting thing is a lot of departments have had great reformers and great people come in and do really good things. The problem is administration changes and you lose those things. And for those of you who know me, this is kind of the button I press a whole lot. What happened in Chihuahua, or what should have happened, and what happens in all other departments is something that should look like this. You have several different mayors. And each mayor would appoint a separate police chief, and each police chief would come with its own set of policies and its own set of personnels. And this happens really across the board and is pretty well documented. What is unique in Chihuahua is that you had, under a pre-government, you had one police chief, and under a pan-government, you had one police chief. Over a 10-year period, only 2 police chiefs. And the more interesting thing was that the CALEA certification accreditation really began under a pre-government and was continued under a pan-government. And that's pretty significant because normally there's not continuity between administrations, even if they're the same political party. And in this case, you got continuity across administrations. So I think that's really the key to success for Chihuahua, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But I really consider Chihuahua to be something of a fluke because continuity by itself is kind of limited, right? I mean, you could have continuity of real bad guys, and that wouldn't be so great. And so would you really... I mean, across the board in Mexico, what you see in police departments are weak institutions, rapid turnover in leadership all the time, and then without accountability. What happened in Chihuahua, the reason I say it's kind of a fluke, and I don't say that in the chapter, but is because you have this, they just have the continuity of leadership. They still don't necessarily have the accountability, and the institutions are increasingly stronger, but certainly 10 years ago were very weak. So I really argue that police reform is not so much a problem of the police. This is a problem of governance. Generally, it's a problem of governance in the Mexican political system. And at the municipal level, of course, it's a problem of municipal governance. Very briefly, because I'm sure some people will raise it, Chihuahua, of course, I call this post-success because Chihuahua had these great successes, and now Chihuahua is kind of, and Chihuahua is very sad because also, not only do you have this incredible police reform at the municipal level, but you had the judicial reforms, and both of those reforms are being brought into question by the current violence, which to a large degree is kind of a separate issue, but it's impossible to separate out, right? Because for citizens, they want results, and a professional police department is really no good for citizens if it's not delivering results. And so this is kind of a problem for those that want to professionalize the police, because results aren't going to be seen right away. And there is a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. So a new administration can come in and say, look, whatever we were doing wasn't working, and we know it's not working because Chihuahua is one of the most dangerous states in the country right now, and we need to start over from scratch. And that danger still exists, even despite the advances in Chihuahua. And so one of my, if I have a normative objective, it's to talk about and promote this kind of angle of continuity. So anyway, that's my time. So thank you very much, appreciate it, and thank you to the book's editors for a wonderful job.
Great. David?
As long as they don't take the chair away, it's a good thing to play musical chairs. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the lessons from the book. And before I do, I want to recognize one of the audience members, Judith Davila, who's here, who was an assistant to the project for several years when she was a student at the University of San Diego. She's, if any of you follow the work that our Justice in Mexico project does to gather data on drug violence in Mexico, she's the face behind the numbers in terms of trying to get at some of the patterns of drug-related violence, and she's now working with the ABA, and we really appreciate that the effort she put into the project. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the lessons here, and the first lesson has to do with the problem of crime in Mexico. What we know about crime in Mexico as a result of a lot of research on the Justice in Mexico project and a lot of work that others have done in Mexico is that really we're talking about a twofold public security problem. We have the problem of ordinary crime and violence, which, as I'll talk about in a moment, has increased dramatically over the last 2 decades in concert with Mexico's domestic political changes, as well as its domestic and as well as in response to economic changes, as I'll point out. But also the problem of organized crime, which particularly since 2000 has led to a dramatic increase in violence. It's really not the problem of organized crime that leads to an increase in violence. Organized crime was doing fine up until 2000 and with relatively little violence. It's really the issue that organized crime is now in greater conflict with the state or vice versa, and the nature of the game of organized crime has changed. But in both cases, there's a really very significant problem, and that's the problem of impunity. And one of the authors, one of the contributors to this volume, Guillermo Zepeda, has done a lot of work to try to emphasize what the life cycle of a crime looks like in Mexico. And what we know is that from crime victimization surveys, for example, we know that most people don't report crimes. In fact, only about 1 out of 4, if we're lucky, and that's a conservative estimate, only about 1 out of 4 crime victims in Mexico actually reports crimes. So of that total universe of all crime, well, first of all, the cifra negra is the total number of crimes that may be happening right now. All of us, right, I know personally I've been a victim of this. I go home, I find out there's a missing sock in the drawer. Right, there's somebody out there stealing my socks, right? But there's crimes that you don't notice, right? There's random crimes that nobody ever even finds out about. The thief gets away with. So the total universe of known crimes, let's call that the crime where the victim knows that they have been a victim of a crime, and they make a conscious decision about whether to report that crime. That happens in about 1 out of 4 cases, or 25 out of 100, let's say it that way. Of those 25 cases where the victim knows that they've been victimized by a crime and reports it to the authorities, of those 25 crimes, only about 5 are actually investigated. Now, part of that has to do with the decision about the prosecutor, about whether it's necessary to do the investigation. Part of it has to do with whether there are any reasonable leads, but a big part of it has to do with the fact that prosecutors are extremely overloaded, in part because of the nature of Mexico's inquisitorial system. They've got a lot of cases, a lot more cases than they can actually handle. So of those 5 crimes that are being investigated, about 2, really 1.6, actually wind up getting prosecuted. So of those 2 that get prosecuted, or 1.6 that get prosecuted, about 1.2 are then brought to trial. So what you'll see here is that the system gets more efficient as it moves closer to final sentencing. 18% of crimes that are reported are investigated. 35% of crimes that are investigated are prosecuted, and 75% of crimes that are prosecuted are brought to trial. Ultimately, of those crimes that are brought to trial, 90% wind up with a sentence, more than 90%. But in the end, that number is really just about 1% of all crimes that we know of. And so you can either look at the glass as, 1% full or 99% empty, depending on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. Now, there are lots of good reasons why. I mean, first of all, the percentage of crimes in the United States that are reported, I think, vacillates between 60 and 70%, or that may be the clearance rate for crimes that are reported. So there are always problems for law enforcement as they try to clear crimes. But the problem in Mexico that stands out for most severely is this problem of impunity. The idea that law enforcement is not effective in getting a handle on crime. Now, I want to point out, and I think that if there's a theme of this volume, it's sympathy for the devil. There's a strong recognition on the part of the authors that police are limited in what they're able to do under the circumstances, and police are frequently demonized for being corrupt and incompetent and so forth. But they're not really given many resources or much of an opportunity to do an effective job. And so we need to be realistic about what police can reasonably accomplish. Even the best police. Right. Even in the United States, some of the best studies on police here in the U.S. and in comparative perspective really raise questions about what police can actually accomplish in terms of getting crime under control when you consider the other factors, the real causes of crime, socioeconomic factors that may lead to crime. And what we see in Mexico, what's been very interesting over the last 20 or 30 years is, or really the last century, and this is like all data on Mexican criminology and lots of crime data, this is an imperfect measure of actual crime trends. It's the number of presuntos delincuentes, or the number of accused criminals that are actually identified by authorities. And it maps nicely onto some other measures that gives us at least a sense that the trends are right, even if it's not a perfectly accurate indicator of crime. But what we see is that over the large part of the 20th century, overall, crime went down up until about the 1970s. Across the board, the rates of crime appeared to fall, and you'll recall a lot of good things were happening in Mexico from, say, the 1920s to the 1970s. The revolution came to an end, so people stopped killing each other. The Cristero Rebellion was put down. The economy started to pick up, beginning in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, with something we called the Mexican Miracle. So the conditions that led to crime and violence in Mexico during that period abated, and the rates of crime perhaps predictably went down. But right around 1976, the time of the first major peso devaluation in almost 20 years in Mexico, a time of significant turmoil following the 1968 massacre, or 1968 protests in Tlatelolco. starting around this time when things get a little bit more chaotic in Mexico, we see an increase in certain kinds of crime in particular. Robbery is notable, assault to a lesser extent. We see rising rates of crime right around here. And it's interesting that it sort of, each peak comes right after a major peso devaluation. So the socioeconomic context that Mexico's been living for the last 20 years, a very turbulent one, may have something to do with the rates of crime that is important to recognize when we try to think about who's to blame here. One indicator that's actually pretty surprising is homicide. When you break out homicide, you can't really see it that well here. When you break out this homicide rate, it's one indicator where we actually see a significant decline in the rates of crime over the course of the 20th century and even over the last 20 or 30 years. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that people are harder to kill these days. In other words, medical science is better able at keeping people alive, which has, again, to do with perhaps the rising rate of assault, because you've been assaulted, not killed. But I think the general consensus among Mexican criminologists is that this is a real and significant decline in homicide rates. And so obviously one of the major exceptions is the kind of drug-related violence that we've seen recently. If we could get rid of drug-related violence in Mexico, it would have a dramatic effect in reducing the overall levels of homicide and would make Mexico look a lot more normal. If we could do that in one particular place, if we could do that in Ciudad Juarez, if we could get rid of all drug-related homicides in Ciudad Juarez, you could probably kick down the national homicide rate by about a third. So it raises questions about how, or illuminates how we might want to consider directing our resources. Okay, that's enough about crime. Even though police may be limited in how they can address the problem of crime, they do play a pivotal role, either in a positive or in a negative sense. As Daniel pointed out, when you have continuity, when you have professionalism among police, they can better respond to some of the challenges of crime that I talked about earlier. When they are not particularly ethical or professional in their behavior, they wind up being part of the problem. And unfortunately, there's both a perception and a reality in Mexico that large numbers of police are involved in organized crime. And we know that actually from a survey that we conducted over the last year of police in Guadalajara. We did a survey of 5,400 municipal police officers in Guadalajara. And among the many questions that we asked them, what's the number one problem that society perceives in terms of public security? About 40%, the largest majority of them said it was drug trafficking. We asked them, what's the problem that municipal police are least able to do anything about, because it's actually a crime of federal jurisdiction. About 40% of them said drug trafficking. We asked them, which of these problems is the local law enforcement organization, where are we most likely to see local police involvement? Again, 40% said drug trafficking. So you can see that when police themselves are involved in the problem, they can be a significant obstacle to the goals that they're supposedly trying to fulfill. I think a fourth lesson is that we get from all these chapters is that better law enforcement requires a more professional, democratic, and community-oriented police force. We also asked those same police who had primary responsibility for helping to combat corruption and improve police forces, and they pointed their fingers at the citizenry, that there needs to be more direct and significant participation on the part of citizens, and that could include things like civilian review boards for police agencies, which I'll talk about in just a second. The last thing, and this is a very hotly debated point right now in Mexico, but it's a point I think that generates that merits significant or serious consideration, and that is the military strategy working? The military was brought in precisely because of the limits of law enforcement in terms of their capacity to address the problem of organized crime, but whether or not the deployment of close to 45,000 troops over the last 3 years throughout different parts of Mexico, including about 18,000 of those concentrated in urban areas. Whether that's been effective at all is highly questionable. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, the rates of violence have continued to rise. So depending on what your metrics of success are, the military has not been particularly effective. The other frightening thing about the military's involvement, and this comes out in Marcos Pablo Moloweznik's chapter, is that very large numbers of military personnel have defected over the last decade. Throughout the Fox administration, we saw the rate of military defections at about 20,000 a year, so that by the end of the Fox administration, 6 years, you had about 120,000 troops that went missing. It's about a 250 to 300 strong army, so that's a big number. More recent work that has looked into this problem by Roderick Camp suggests that the vast majority of those are really not a problem. They're guys who show up and within 2 weeks they decide they really don't like living in the military barracks, they don't like eating ramen noodles every day, and they decide to go home. So let's just assume that of the, I think it was 123,000 that went missing in the Fox administration. Let's assume that 98 or 99% of them just went back to the farm. I'm still worried about the 3,000 that are left over that may have taken up with organized crime, particularly because what we also find is that a surprising number of officer rank personnel, highly trained, highly educated personnel have defected from the military as well. Bottom line, in terms of recommendations, we make, I think, a very strong case that there's a need to improve not just salaries. As Daniel pointed out, the average police officer, again in our study, earned about $600 a month, lived at home and was about 38 years old, which is relatively old. I don't consider it that old, but it's relatively old for police officers who, by the time you're turning 38, 40 in the United States, you're getting ready to retire. There are not adequate pension programs for Mexican police. There are not adequate life insurance programs. The working conditions that they operate, 70% of the officers that we talk to work more than 70 hours a week. And they work turns or shifts that often go above 12 hours, even as high as 24 hours without a break. That's not a way to get good results from your police force. A second important recommendation is to continue to promote judicial reforms and due process for the accused as a way of raising the bar for police and prosecutors. As a good friend of mine in law enforcement once said to me, although we don't like public defenders, the best quality control for police and prosecutors is to make sure that there's a strong defense for the accused, so that the standard of proof for the state is very high. Third, we really need to strengthen and institutionalize internal and external control mechanisms. Mexico is a little while away from having its first Serpico, its first courageous police officer who stands up to organized crime and helps to stand up to police corruption and bring about better standards. They probably have had a few like that, but they're probably dead. The idea of a police officer standing up to and calling for a public investigation of crime inside a police department is many years down the line, but creating the public commissions and the internal processes for review that can lead to greater transparency will open up opportunities for that kind of whistleblowing. The other, as Daniel points out, the other issue is to promote continuous career development and greater continuity across administrations. The President Calderon, has recently proposed the idea of re-election, an idea for which lots of legislators have a great deal of support, but for which the Mexican public, I think only about 14% of ordinary Mexicans think it's a good idea. There needs to be really serious public debate about the value of administrative continuity and re-election in a country that has had a long history, unfortunately, of authoritarianism and abuse of power. So that's an important issue that hopefully will be coming down the line in the future. A final recommendation there needs to be a clear exit strategy, a clear role, and a longer-term exit strategy for military operations in Mexico. What's disturbing about a recent Mitofsky poll that came out just very recently is that from January of last year to January of this year, the public support for the military, which has traditionally been the most publicly supported government institution. I mean, right up there behind the Catholic Church is the Mexican military in terms of overall public support. In the last year, it's seen basically a 5% decline in terms of public support, 5-7% decline, and that's very disturbing because those data come from January, not from February, after the Ciudad Juarez massacre, which I think has even further degraded public support for the overall effort in the war on drugs in Mexico. So in the end, I think we need to realize that the long-term answer is not to keep the military engaged in this effort, and I think that Mexican authorities certainly would recognize that. But to figure out how to strengthen domestic law enforcement institutions, part of that debate is going on right now in Mexico due to very significant changes proposed by the Secretary of Public Security, which would basically dissolve municipal police forces like the ones that Daniel's talking about, and put all of those local police officers under the control of state governors. I think there are real questions about whether there's any greater integrity at the state level than there is at the local level. But certainly it is true that local police have been an obstacle in very significant ways to federal and to a lesser extent state efforts to try to get a handle on local situations. And that's part of what's driving that reform. Those who want to preserve municipal police forces as a kind of community police force are really going to have to, I think, in the next few months, make a strong case that local police forces can and should be salvaged. We'll see what happens. The last issue is I think we really need to be conscious of the fact that as much as Calderon is beloved by the United States and beloved by the U.S. government, he's only there for 2 more years. And whether it comes to judicial reform or police reform or how we deal with the cartels, we don't know what's going to happen in 2 years or what the longer-term strategy is going to look like. All signs seem to point to a growing frustration with the current administration and its various strategies. Much of that is due to the economic situation, and hopefully that will turn around. But when you ask people who is going to be who's going to be coming to power in 2012, there's a pretty clear and strong signal coming from ordinary Mexicans that it's going to be we're going back to the future. Right? We're going back to the PRI as the dominant or as the sitting party in government, and we need to start thinking about what that means and how best to plan for having a longer term impact of anything we're trying to do right now, figuring out who our potential partners are in a future PRI administration and how we can get them on board with locking in some of the changes, very significant changes that Calderon has made. I'll leave the remainder of the time to our discussants, and thank you all for joining us.
Great. Yeah, we invited a couple colleagues to make some comments. I'm going to turn it over to Marcelo Bergman, Professor Bergman.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this presentation, the presentation of this wonderful book. I have no doubt that Police and Public Security in Mexico, which is being launched today, will be a must-read book for those that are interested in Mexico in general and in public security and police reform in particular. Robert Donnelly and David Shirk have accomplished something that is rarely seen in this type of volumes. They have put together a book that blends both the hard and painstaking empirical research that specialists like, but also a text that reads smoothly and that has a wider appeal for the non-specialized reader. This is particularly relevant for audiences that are eager to learn about a topic that is often on front-page news. This is a book. Well, I'm writing because my English, as you hear, is not the best, so I prefer to keep close to the text. This book is important for several reasons. First, it brings cutting-edge research to wider audiences. It does so with plain language, simple analysis, and based on original research. Second, the authors masterfully address the most relevant topics related to the dramatic collapse of public security in Mexico. This book deals with the trends in rising criminality, the increasing role of organized crime, the alarming weaknesses of police institutions, the role of military forces, the pitfalls of law enforcement reforms, and the challenges of increasing security while preserving human rights. Third, these books explore regions that the traditional research establishment in Mexico rarely does. Most chapters transcend the Mexico City urban area and successfully show that criminality and insecurity is a national rather than a regional problem. Chapters delve into states such as Jalisco and Chihuahua, and they analyze the problems of different urban areas. Fourth, this book provides the reader a roadmap of the upcoming challenges that Mexico faces in the following years. The introductory chapter thus not only gives the classic overview of the problems and contents of the book, but also it ventures into the critical problems of Mexican society and the Mexican government need to tackle to successfully address the challenges posed by drug trafficking and the dramatic rise in street crime. Fifth, the chapters of these books rely on a wide variety of methodologies. Some papers are quantitative, using the best data available, sometimes personally collected by the authors. Other papers are based on ethnographic work, from participatory observation to in-depth interviews. Others use legal documents and historical archival information. All chapters blend into a coherent piece, and each methodological approach provides a new layer of valuable information. Sixth, this book has 8 chapters written by very prominent scholars. In this field, I can probably think of just 20 good specialists. This book already has 8 of them. That in itself is a major accomplishment. Those who will read this book will certainly be reading the very best of this scholarship. The wealth and prose of the different chapters nicely complement each other. As usual, the data-driven descriptions by Guillermo Cepeda are superb. Moloesnik analysis of the increasing role of the military in public security is very illuminating. The 2 extraordinary anthropological works by Suarez de Garay and by my good friend Elena Saola describe the pathetic reality of the police forces in Mexico. And no serious reform can be explored without first reading this research. The historical account by Carlos Flores on how organized crime and corruption of public officers intertwine deserves careful reading. Although I do not share the optimistic view of Sabat's, you already opened the umbrella Sabat's article on the reforms in Chihuahua, it is a well-written and researched piece. And Jorge Quintero's articles on the role of human rights played under the democratic law enforcement is a topic that rightly deserves careful examination. Finally, the concluding chapter by Sherk brings, as usual, David's gifted ability to summarize the main problems and masterfully signaling the challenges of future policies and research agenda. Despite all these marvelous accomplishments, I do have a couple of reservations. Probably another one will be the cover. I don't like it, but it's okay. I have a couple of reservations about some conclusions drawn from this project. I know that David and Robert are inherently optimistic. As such, they believe that well-intended and well-designed law enforcement reforms might work. I remain skeptic. But the jury is out there, and several years from now, we will all see how this unfolds. Secondly, and this is for an academic and philosophical dialogue, I sense that the contributors of this book believe that order was broken 15 or 20 years ago, but that it can be restored. That crime and violence are deviation of a sort of a Durkheimian order, and that this order can be reestablished. This in itself is not a problem, but such an approach leads to an overemphasis on public security measures instead of a management of a social crisis approach. In short, this book appears to be based on a paradigm that says that we have a problem with an increasing number of deviants that are wreaking havoc on Mexican society. However, if we are successful in apprehending and punish those deviants, things will slowly get back to normal. I believe instead that perhaps what we are witnessing is a new social and economic conflict that systemically affects Mexican society. This approach leads to an emphasis on measures of smoothing social mobilization, strengthening social inclusion mechanism, reduce income inequality, and so on. In short, I think that probably law enforcement will not get much done even if police and courts perform adequately. These observations do not contrast, but rather complement this volume. I believe that the alarming security problem in Mexico calls for in-depth and solid examination of facts and institutional performance. I cannot think of a better informed and better timely volume, like you said, it's really timely, volume than the one it is presented this afternoon. This book will be read widely, will motivate further research, and will stimulate creative proposals. You cannot ask for more than that from an intellectual project. In my view, Donnelly and Shirk accomplished these goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let's turn now, lastly, to Michael McCullough, who I note is also in his background a former public defender.
Yes.
So can speak from experience here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if there are police officers here, I hope they'll forgive me for that, but I guess we'll find out. Let's see. First of all, thank you. First of all, to the Woodrow Wilson Center, to Andrew Seeley, David Shirk, Cindy Arnson, and Eric Olson for inviting me, and of course to Rob Donnelly in particular for personally extending the invitation to be with you today and here with such distinguished company to discuss a book which I like. At least I like the cover. I would also like to dispute respectfully with the discussant on that. I think it actually captures some of the content. I've been asked to speak about judicial reform and its role in the context of police reform, and I know the time is short, so I won't take up much time. I think you need time for the Q&A. But I would like to speak briefly to that, and specifically to Dr. Cepeda's chapter. First of all, I'd like to congratulate him for his work. I think it captures the moment very well. We do clearly have a situation in which the police sector is in flux. It's confronting unprecedented challenges. But at the same time, it's also implementing substantial reforms. His chapter articulates the need for the police to evolve as a result. I actually was, in fact, in my public defender days, speaking with a police officer years ago, and he said, it's tough to be a cop now. Back in the day, we had to patrol and occasionally make an arrest, and that was it. And policing has become much more difficult. And I knew what he meant, because you have to be a part police officer, part attorney, part social worker, part conciliator. And I think that, to some degree, is part of what's driving the police reform process in Mexico. But it's being driven specifically by these two reforms, which require police to do more and to be more. Again, it's requiring them to confront criminal syndicates, very sophisticated and very dangerous, but it's also requiring them to be more mindful of due process and human rights to a larger extent than they ever were before. One logical reaction to that would be that these are two conflicting demands, that police cannot be both more aggressive in confronting police syndicates and yet more respectful of human rights. And I understand that view. But I think the important point, and I think that this is Dr. Cepeda's point as well, is that It doesn't require tougher policing. It requires smarter policing. What it requires is for the police, as Dr. Cepeda notes, to transform themselves from being protectors not of government interests or of a particular political administration, but of society, as should be the case. So the police do need to engage in smarter policing, and part of smarter policing requires that they have political support. By political support, I'm referring to from two sources. One is mutual, well, I refer to mutual trust generally, but specifically with the public at large and also with other justice sector institutions. We've seen, and I think my colleagues could speak to this far better than I could, but we've seen examples of this mistrust in Mexico in recent years, everything from a high turnover rate among police officials, which Dr. Cepeda mentioned and which David spoke to as well, to the militarization of police operations, in which in some cases the police have effectively been supplanted by the military, not just supplemented. But we've even seen the extreme case of police officers having their guns taken away in Tijuana, for example. And worse still, and I think this is symptomatic of mistrust as anything we could imagine, is that police or citizens are afraid to report crimes. They're afraid to report crimes for the obvious reason, as has already been discussed, that people suspect, some cases accurately suspect, that the police are part of the problem, not part of the solution. So there needs to be trust from the public and from the justice sector institutions. ABA Rowley has a program in Panama which speaks to this need to foment trust between the police and the public and also justice sector institutions. We've recently published, or we're in the process of publishing, a manual, an investigative manual, but which also speaks to the, quote, culture of lawfulness, which emphasizes the importance of due process and human rights protections among the police. And one of the points that this manual makes is that it's to the police's benefit to be respectful and mindful of these rights, that these aren't just a burden, that in fact they do present an opportunity, and that's something that I would like to speak to. As again, just to be clear, judicial reform is obviously is the catalyst for a lot of these changes. We do have an accusatorial system, which has as fundamental tenets contradiction and publicity, specifically that any police officer or any witness, but in this case a police officer, that makes an assertion has to come to court and be prepared to defend that assertion under oath, under cross-examination. So the police now are increasingly recognizing in Mexico and elsewhere that where before they could write a report, file it away, and allow the machinery of the system to proceed, know that nothing else would ever be asked of him or her, now they're having to engage in this new mindset. But it's creating a lot of uncertainty. And that's, I think, the point that I would like to make here. Dr. Cepeda talks about the need for guidelines to control police, which I think we can all understand and appreciate. But I think these guidelines also, as I mentioned in the case of our Panama manual, I think in Mexico as elsewhere, it's important in the judicial reform process to make clear to the police that these guidelines actually do afford them an opportunity. The police are facing a lot of uncertainty with these new systems, and they need to know that what the rules are. Specifically, two types of rules. One is the rules of engagement, so to speak, and the other, a Spanish expression, which it doesn't translate as well to English, but rayar la cancha, basically meaning sort of like setting the rules of the game. In terms of the rules of engagement, the police do want to know what the rules are. They need to know what their benchmarks for success are. They need to know that by complying with due process considerations and human rights, that if they check off the list, so to speak, that in fact the system will back them, that they're not going to be questioned for everything that they do, that if they question a suspect, provided obviously that they don't engage in torture or anything improper or even coercive, if they advise the person of their rights, if the person confesses, 99% of the time that's going to be enough for the statement to be admitted. Similarly, if they're swearing out a warrant to go conduct a seizure of evidence or whatever, again, they need to know that if they check off the list, if they have probable cause, a reliable informant, good faith to believe that what is ostensibly there is there, that again, the system will generally back them. And so it may sound semantical, but I think in these judicial reform processes, it is important for the police to know that there is a threshold. They obviously can't go past a certain point, but they need to know that these guidelines are there for their benefit as much as anything, so that they understand what they can do, what's being asked of them, so that they can effectively perform their work, and that society and justice sector institutions will in turn back them. And then in terms of the rayar la cancha, or setting the ground rules, police need to know where their work begins and where the work of other institutions begins. This has been a recurring problem in many Latin American countries. There's a traditional rivalry between police and prosecutors in most countries, I think including to a lesser degree in the U.S. And so when these judicial reform processes are underway, frequently those concerns are highlighted. And I think it's worth noting at this point that, again, the police need to know what's expected of them, where their work begins, but also where the work of other institutions ends. They need to know that the prosecutor is there, for example, to help guide the investigation, but to allow the police officer to do his or her job, to allow the investigator to do his or her job, and to go with their instincts and to conduct an investigation as they see fit. And there are a number of mechanisms to do this, and time doesn't really allow me to get into that, but there are instances where you can literally force police and prosecutors to work side by side, working under a form of process engineering, a process whereby both the police and prosecutors are part of the same team, taking complaints, referring for investigation and charging, and they begin to see themselves not as competing institutions, but as co-partners to one process. So there are ways in which this can be done in a way that, again, allows the police and other institutions to understand their roles. In conclusion, again, I would simply like to commend Dr. Cepeda for his work. I think this is a very, very useful chapter on police and the criminal justice system in Mexico. I think, again, that as he notes, it's very important for the police to have guidelines for purposes of control, but I would also go beyond and say that those guidelines do present an opportunity to provide the necessary reassurance for police so that there is mutual trust between them, society at large, and other justice sector institutions. And without more, again, thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have a little bit of time. I think I'll take about 3 questions. If you raise your hand, Mike, Miguel, and Chris will bring a mic over to you. Lest we don't get to you, we are also having a little reception afterwards out here in the foyer. So if you don't get your question in, you'll have a chance to ask it directly to our panelists here. So we should have some time. Right here? If you just identify yourself and...
Ron Seckinger, Booz Allen Hamilton. David suggested, and I would agree, that the number of drug-related murders is not the most appropriate metric for success. So what I'd like to ask is, what are the metrics for success, and what would success look like to the Mexican government?
Okay, and then Diana Negroponte is right behind you. Maybe you can just pass it over the table there. Is it not on? There it is. Yeah, you got it.
Last week at the Inter-American Defense College, the Mexican brigadier generals complained about the sophisticated equipment that the Mexican police are using. And their criticism was based on the fact that the police have now, in effect, become a quasi-military institution. Are we seeing the evolution of a gendarmerie?
Well, we can take one more. Go ahead. Here.
Matthew Maurer from Sentinel HS Group. I had a question that was backing up a little bit from local level police, discussing the interactions between other criminal justice organizations, as you mentioned. There was an op-ed by Creel, Santiago Creel, recently, talking about who was taking the lead on some of these things, and I was just wondering if you're familiar with the article, if someone could address some of the points in that and the way forward on handling both the DTOs, some of the border crime issues on the northern and southern border in Mexico, and the future coordinating role of the federal police with the other police institutions in Mexico.
Great. Every meeting I've been in recently, David Shirk has asked about the metrics of success, so I'm going to ask him to answer that question.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah. We were at a forum last evening where that was my question. What are the metrics of success? And to me, violence is an imperfect measure of success, precisely because we didn't see violence before, but let's say to the degree we see in after 2006 or even after 2000, precisely because the government was, by Carlos Flores' account in our book, by and large complicit with drug trafficking organizations, even if it was inadvertently, even if it was just some members of the state that were facilitating drug trafficking organizations. There was no need. Well, actually, Flores goes even further than that. It's not just that the DTOs were protected by the state; it's that they were all so well protected that the plazas were actually carefully distributed among drug trafficking organizations. And as the consensus on how to control those plazas broke down, as the state was taken away as a kind of mediator among various drug trafficking organizations, we started to see the clash among them. It's sort of akin to the international system, where there's no central hierarchical power controlling those drug trafficking organizations. There's chaos, so violence is effectively a good thing, because it means that the state is not as complicit as it once was in working with organized crime groups. And certainly the point is debatable how complicit the Mexican state was, and I don't want to open up a can of worms there, but certainly that's the argument of at least some of our authors. That said, I do think that the violence is a problem. Right now, when you have, as we saw last year, close to 7,000 deaths and a rate of about 6, just counting the drug cartel-related deaths, they represent nationwide about 6. There are about 6 per 100,000. Right, that's pretty high. If there are any other murders that go on, let's say that represents half of murders. It's a pretty high rate. But when you take that to the specific geographic location, somewhere like Tijuana, you have a rate that approaches 40 drug-related killings per 100,000. I'm sorry, in Tijuana it's about 20, but in Ciudad Juarez it's about 40. Well, Chihuahua, the state of Chihuahua, it's about 40. In the city of Chihuahua, it estimates range as high as 80 or 90 per 100,000. That's really bad. If the World Health Organization classifies 20 homicides per 100,000 as an epidemic rate, there's 4 times an epidemic rate in a place like Ciudad Juarez. And like I said, if you got rid of those homicides completely in Ciudad Juarez, it would make an enormous dent in the overall national homicide rate. So I think the violence is certainly a contributor to the perception that Mexico is a failed state. It's a contributor to the perception of Mexican citizens that there is impunity and an inability of the government to manage its affairs. So something has to be done to try to reduce the violence while at the same time taking on these organizations. So that's one issue, and it's a complex one. So it's not really an answer as to whether that's an effective metric or not, but it at least explores the issue of violence. To me, the most important measure of whether being successful against drug traffickers is a simple one, and that is, are we having any measurable impact on the flow of drugs into the flow and accessibility of drugs in the United States? And in the aggregate, it doesn't seem like we're having that great of an effect. Certainly, drug consumption patterns appear to have changed in the United States in the sense that there are fewer cocaine, a smaller proportion of the population is using cocaine, heroin. Drug use as a proportion of the use of those illicit drugs appears to have fallen proportionately in the United States. The problem is that other kinds of drugs, Oxycontin and so forth, have not necessarily changed. There seems to be a quotient of the human population in our country that always has some kind of chemical dependency. It's just what's the drug of choice at that particular moment. So I don't think I think what would be really useful in identifying measures of success when it comes to drug trafficking and whether we're actually having an impact on drugs would be to look at what percentage of drugs are we actually stopping, because it's not clear to me that we're really stopping. If we say we've captured X kilos of cocaine in a given year, we never attempt to measure that against the total. Right? So if we caught 3 tons of cocaine, we don't know if there are 1 billion tons of cocaine coming across the border. So to have a metric of success, you have to know what's the total aggregate supply or population. The same goes with arms. We have great metrics for the number of arms that we're capturing or finding in Mexico, but we don't really have any real sense of what's the total number of arms that are flowing across the border. And with cash, gosh, the metrics on cash are amazing. There are either 19 or $39 billion flowing back to Mexico every year from drug trafficking proceeds. That's a huge spread. We have no idea if that's even close to the amount of money that drug trafficking organizations have. But of that, let's just say 20 billion that drug traffickers are taking back to Mexico, how much are we catching? 5%? To me, those are the really important metrics, and I think I don't personally feel that we have seen that much success on any of those significant metrics of how we gauge drug trafficking. And I think that has led to a lot of discussion and debate about, for example, legalization of drugs. And unfortunately, even if we legalize drugs tomorrow in Mexico, it's not going to get rid of organized crime. In fact, it'll probably make them more desperate in the short term in trying to figure out new sources of revenue, which means kidnapping, bank robbery, and other kinds of common crime. So it's an important. I think it's important for us to ask the question of whether the war on drugs is working in the way that we're fighting it, and whether there are alternative ways that we could do it. But it's a question we have to ask very carefully and with serious consideration of what are the sort of costs and benefits of the different strategies that we employ. I don't know if Rob or anyone else wants to jump in on that.
Or does anybody want to tackle one of the other questions?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, there are other questions. The militarization question, the detail. I've talked way too long.
Daniel, Robert?
And those are the tougher questions.
Well, I believe Diana's question spoke to the centralization of the police at the national level, the development of carabineros in Mexico. Is that?
Well, it's the arming of police to a level of sophistication that they have the capacity to carry out military operations. So are we in fact seeing the development of a French-style police force?
I'm happy to hop in. And just to follow up on the metric question, I mean, obviously we care about results, but I think processes matter here as well. And so there are lots of, I mean, Mexico has set up these observatorios ciudadanos that are measuring and developing metrics, and they are tending to look at more results. What I would like to see are more kind of process things. I mean, the amount of distrust on the police is so overwhelming, and if you could see significant gains in the percent of police with high school degrees, in the number of hours training received,
in the number of successful prosecutions of corrupt cops. Like, these would do a lot of things to develop confidence. And if, in fact, the state is doing these things, then there is an incentive to build reliable indicators that could be tracked over time to show those kinds of differences. So for me, those kinds of process indicators are important in this. Even though it's not obviously what the end result we want to. As for the militarization question, I think it's a great one. I noticed that one of the conclusions that David put up there was, that we need to move towards a more democratic, more community-oriented kind of policing, and that is the exact opposite direction that things are moving in Mexico. That was arguably the direction during the Fox administration during the early 2000s, and there are still remnants of that, but a lot of the big departments are now run by generals, and there is a strong militarization push. Chihuahua, the director that had served for 5 years, stepped down in 2009 and was replaced by a retired general. So even in cases where there kind of had been great examples of lots of community-oriented policing kind of projects, there is a movement away from that. I argue that in terms of police reform, there's kind of three models, and one is limited discretion. So we can't trust the police at all. We need to take away their guns. We need to take away their authority. We need to just have them be security guards that wander around. And that arguably was the model for a very long time in Mexico. And so why the police is largely not very effective is because all of their authority and abilities were stripped away. There's the professionalization model, which might be kind of the ideal, and what arguably happened in the United States in the 80s, 90s, problem-oriented policing, community-oriented policing. Police are problem solvers. They will go into the communities. They will work with the communities to develop problems to crime problems. The militarization model is kind of an in-between those two approaches, where orders are it's still very much a hierarchical organization. Orders come down from the top. Your loyalty is to your boss and not to the citizens out on the street. And I think there's a real danger in that because. And there's not enough discussion about this because both are kind of advocating better selection criteria, better education and training, better procedures, better promotion criteria, accountability. Like the package of reforms is the same, but the spirit of the reforms is very different in a professionalization model versus in a militarization model. And I would agree with you that we are moving in a direction. I was just told the other day the Querétaro, which was another example of a very successful kind of civilian-oriented led effort. They renamed their police force Citizen Security. Now that's to kind of symbolize this move towards citizens and working with citizens, and that changed. And I was just they had this big armored vehicle, and they're using it as a patrol vehicle. And I mean, this is an armored vehicle that would be used exclusively by the military, and they're using it as a patrol vehicle to show that they're out there and present and look at the new toys that the police has. So it is a real danger. These things tend to be pendulums, and so I think we're going to see lots of militarization, and then 10 years from now there'll be more moved back and forth, and it's that lack of continuity and lack of a clear vision of where we're going. So I, of course, would like to see more professionalization and less militarization. So that's my answer on that one. And then what was the last question? The coordination.
Actually, the coordination of police.
Strategy in general. So right now there seems to be a disconnect in who's supposed to lead what. Of course, Serena's taking a lead role in a lot of these functions right now, with the understanding, whether implicit or explicit, that it will shift to the federal police. Mm-hmm. In terms of how the federal police is going to interact with the more local police, as we've talked mostly about in public security matters, just your thoughts on how that might look and what kind of advice is being given right now.
I have some thoughts, but
just one quick thing I'll say about the interaction between federal and local police that's different now under the new reforms that passed over the last 2 years is that federal police are now able, one of the interesting things that I've been looking at lately is the ability of federal police to take over local investigations if they deem necessary through a process called attraction or atracción. They're now able to, if you remember on the Fox administration, when it came to the femicides in Ciudad Juarez, the Fox administration kind of threw up its hands and said, we can't really go in. It's a crime of local jurisdiction. We have no ability to respond to this. The new constitutional amendments now enable the the Fox administration. I'm sorry, not the Fox. Enable the federal government through CIEDO, the special assistant attorney for the prosecution of organized crime, to take on certain kinds of cases, particularly organized crime cases that are deemed over the heads of too to take on. But I think is, how does the federal police coordinate with the Ministerios Públicos or with the Attorney General's office to prosecute, to investigate crimes? They've started now in the federal police training actual police investigators to be involved in that process, but theoretically it's supposed to be controlled by the Ministerio Público, and it's not clear to me that the protocols have been worked out in a way that there are adequate checks and balances in how that's going to be managed. And I don't, beyond that, I don't know how that's going to be worked out. I mean, I think they're still in the process of working that out.
I'm going to give Marcelo Bergman the last word here, and we'll have to just kind of move the conversation out into the hallway because we've run out of time. So why don't? No, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I'm talking about the metrics and way to measure. We are doing at CIDE, I was directing a survey for the last 5 years, a victimization survey for the Mexico City and the surrounding areas. We started in 2005, and we completed the 10th just recently. And the data shows clearly that at least 1 every 2 families had, one of the members had been victimized over the last year. That is to say that every 50% of the families have 1 victim over the last year. This has increased from 2005, when we had then about 25%. That is to say, from 25 to 50%. It doubled over the last 4 or 5 years in the Mexico City area. There is reason to believe that this is happening at different levels. It happens everywhere in Mexico. Now, to me, that's a measure of what we are doing, if we are doing things right or wrong. If families continue to be victimized, and we are not talking about homicide, we are not talking about drug trafficking, we are talking about street crimes, okay? Their car being stolen, their laptop being stolen, there's some aggression, etc., etc. This has a potentially, I believe, more danger than the real drug trafficking, although I don't diminish about that problem, but it creates a society of fear, of revenge, difficult to manage, of alienation. In short, there is a need for a comprehensive approach, not just a military or police or a law enforcement approach. If that is the only reliance on law enforcement, things not necessarily will work out for the better, and it would take a long time to correct this. On the other hand, examples as Bogota, recently Sao Paulo, that had seen a dramatic in homicide and in property crime, shows that it can be done, but it has to be done comprehensively, not only relying on law enforcement. I'm not denying on the importance of law enforcement, but they have to tackle different things. And I'm afraid, and this is a personal take, that this the Calderon government is not taking that part very seriously. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for your patience and for the panelists' insightful comments. Again, we invite you to stay around to have a snack or whatever and ask the really hard questions in the hallway. Thank you all very much.